Welcome to Sustainability Now, an exploration of technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. Designed for socially conscious entrepreneurs and individuals interested in responsible stewardship of the planet. Sustainability Now covers food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. I am beside myself with excitement to introduce Carol Sanford to you. Carol is a best-selling author, speaker, disruptor, and educator, and works with top-level business executives from companies such as Google, DuPont, Intel, P&G, seventh generation, to change the very nature of work. Carol's a positive contrarian who brings old practices into modern business, developing work systems that enable people to act on their motivation and generate a continuous stream of innovation. Her award-winning books, The Responsible Business and The Responsible Entrepreneur, just 2 of the 7 she's written, are required reading at leading business and management schools, including Harvard, Stanford, Haas Berkeley, and MIT. Carol's a founder and designer of the Regenerative Business Development Community, as well as the Regenerative Change Agent Development Community, with global membership and influence. Carol, it is such an honor and delight to be here with you, to have you with us. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you for inviting me, Mara. I'm looking forward to talking with you. I want to add one thing to your introduction, if I could. I probably wrote this on the page, but what I do is use ancient and lineage practices, not old outdated ones, so they are drawing on deep lineage traditions in sacred traditions, but also I am part Mohawk, and so I was brought along as a young'un by my grandfather and taught much of the Mohawk Iroquois upbringing. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about when I say old.
I love that, and it makes so much more sense. So when you talk about ancient and lineage practices, can you be specific a little bit so that it gives us an orientation point?
Sure. My grandfather taught me something called 7 disciplines. I don't call them anymore. I call them the 7 first principles of life. And it was like, if something is alive, it will have these 7 characteristics. They will be a whole, not a fragment or a part or like a river in a life shed. The life shed is a whole. It has essence, which means it has its own distinctive being. So you, Mira, have your own distinctive being, but even people who believe similar to you or work with you will still have their own. So essence. The third thing is you work from principles and not problems. So you're working with the essence of Mira to find potential, your unique potential, not the generic, everybody has potential. The fourth principle is development. So we're born as incomplete beings. We are unfinished, and most of the time we die unfinished because no one's developing our capacity for consciousness, for the ability to see and understand the complexity, and instead we stay dumbed down. The fifth one is nodal, nested. We are nested in beings. So you and I are nested each in our own family, and those families are nested in neighborhoods or tribes or communities, and we often end up nested in a continent, on a planet, and we forget that we are nested beings, not independent entities. Then the 6th one is nodal, and nodal is a concept you can only understand if you look at something like acupuncture, where you can put a needle in 2 points, and then you have a link and you have an entanglement between those 2 points. So if one moves, the other moves. And so nodal is knowing where do you put the needle, and that can be in a group you're working with, or in your case, a client you're working with. They have nodal things that if you engage or intercede will move the whole. And the final 7th one is fields. Everything is existing in a field that's alive. And that is the entanglement idea, where you can move one thing and it will move much more, move the whole. And we don't know how to notice or build or rebuild fields, so we can go do work. And we can tell, though, when we walk into a group, it has a field or it doesn't. It's scattered, or it has something that would define the whole. My grandfather taught me, and you can find this in Christian and Birdie's work also, and in the Maori, all have some kind of principles. Well, the ones I was engaged with were my Mohawk grandfather, and that was one example.
You just gave us a 4-year lesson, a lesson that'll take us 4 years to begin to unwrap, I think.
Oh, it'll be about 100.
Okay, I'll take that.
I know that because I don't have it yet, and I'm 80.
So let me ask, these 7 principles, and you numbered them, and I'm wondering, is there a significance to the order in which they're presented in order for us to more deeply understand them?
Because we are humans who have a hard time seeing the whole, I often, the first time I present them, give you a flow. So if you want to know the essence of something, you have to start with it as a whole, not as personality and fragment. If you want to understand how to develop something, you have to do essence of potential, and before you know how to develop it, otherwise you make it generic. So it is a 7-term system you draw with 2 triangles upside down from one another, slightly overlapping. When you're in Pythagoras community, a 7-term system is written like that. In my school that we're all part of, we write it that way also. So when you look at my book, which has the 7 first principles, I call them first principles, they're like the ground of which it starts, then it's easier to learn it if you can see them building on one another. But they all work in a field together. Mm-hmm. So they aren't independent, isolated parts. They are all part of one entity, and you can either see them building one another, or you can draw the septet and begin to see their dynamics. So yes, there's a reason, but it changes depending on how you order them and what you're trying to bring about. My grandfather used to quiz me a lot. He was a fairly poor man who worked for the Farm Bureau, and taught farmers because he knew indigenous ways of farming. He taught and answered a lot of questions about farming. But he also said everything is driven by these 7 principles. So he would constantly ask me, how do you see the whole of this? And when whole, we used to sing parts. We fragment, we chop up things, and then we work on the problems and the issues. And he was trying to teach me not to be conditioned by the European way of fragmenting, but the indigenous way of holding as a whole. So I'm most familiar and most close to my grandfather's version of the 7 principles. Although if we spend a little time, I'm writing a paper today on how Kwanzaa, which we're in the middle of, the week of Kwanzaa, has also 7 principles that follow a template, but not the wording. They have a slightly different paradigm at work, but there's something innate. And the Maori have 7. Even in Jewish, fairly conservative traditions, there's 7 that show the relationship between a spiritual practice. So it's
The 7 days of creation we can look at as well.
7 days a week. They're constant. And then there are things that are 8 and 9. We look at from 1 term, 2 term, 3 term, up through my books. If you look, all are written on different orders of understanding. They're either pentad, my first book, tetrad, my second book, triad, my third book. I think I did. Well, all of them have one of the ordering systems.
When you and I had a conversation, first of all, I'm fascinated by the notion of essence, and I do a lot of that in my coaching practice, working with really connecting with and expressing our essence. And so knowing that I have about 16 different questions around that. First, one is that when you and I had a prior conversation, you said about yourself, my essence is to disrupt certainty.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking of that a lot. And I'm wondering about the driver behind the notion of disrupting certainty, because I don't imagine that it's for its own purpose, just for the purpose of disruption, but that there's something that generates or comes alive from that disruption. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I don't think I picked my essence. I think it picks me before I was born. And yeah, I also believe, and I may call this stuff up potentially. Who knows whether I'm right? I'm not attached to what I'm saying is absolutely true. You have to have a cosmology to make your world work. How does it work? So I believe before I was born, I picked to have ALS, which I have, this terrible degenerative disease. And people say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. That's the most horrible way to die. And I agree. I said, but I also think that I knew I was going to work on consciousness and understanding the role of death, all of that stuff in my life. And I figured I could manage it better than most people. So I picked that, but I also picked a soul that was always working on disruption. Now, the reason for disruption, and the reason if I picked it, I did, is our biggest problem is we are mechanical beings. We are not thinking beings. We say we're thinking, but we're really thoughting. And that's David Bohm's term. He said, we're spewing out things we've gotten from somebody else, never examined, don't even usually know what we're saying. And if somebody asks us, where did you get that idea? We can't tell them because we're all sound asleep. And most lineage traditions teach us that we're mechanical beings and we're asleep. Depending on which school you're in, there are different terms. So an only way to wake people up in the Middle Eastern traditions is by a conscious shock, something that has people trotting along thinking everything's fine, and you hit them in the face, not literally, but with an idea that really disrupts what they're so certain about. Now, they have 2 choices. Well, I know there's probably more, but you can either be insulted because I ask you something that's very disruptive. You can't answer. It's very different than what you thought. Or you can say, oh, how exciting, I'm awake. I can actually, and you did that with me. I loved it. So most people, now there's a rule about this, and not everybody can be a disruptor of certainty, because if you're attached to your own certainty, it won't work. You got to not be attached. And you also have to be willing to not be insulted or disturbed by anything comes back. Your work is with love, and that's core. You must love the person you do it to. You can't do it to a waitress or a taxi driver or somebody you're never going to see again. When you and I started talking, we were talking about continuing an engagement. So now the first criteria is met for disrupting certainty. Mine, I work on every day. I constantly say, when I say I believe something, I may make this up. I say that all the time because it reminds me I can't be certain about something. And so the purpose of disrupting certainty is consciousness and overcoming mechanicalness, but you have to be really genuinely willing to not make yourself be certain. And that's the hardest part, because I'm a real good thinker. I'm very imaginative and innovative. And I get an idea and think, oh my God, nobody's ever written this. Nobody's ever said this. Oh my God. And I go, yeah, but you're probably wrong. And so if I can remember to have that relationship, now I'm useful as a disruptor of certainty. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm thinking about the disruption of certainty in terms of generating new thought.
Yeah.
Because you said we're mechanical beings. We have these patterns of being, of thought, of perception.
Yeah.
And the world that we're living into is making demands that have never been made before if we're to create the level of change that is called for humanity to survive on the
Yeah.
planet, right? And so
Oh,
one of my deepest fascinations is, how do we generate truly new thought? How do we
hey,
move beyond problem into, and this is something else I wanted to ask you about. I said something about possibility in a prior conversation, and you said not possibility, potential. And I would like to talk about the distinction there as well.
yeah. Okay. Possibilities is a personality experience where we brainstorm, we think about all the possibilities. So it's also a being development experience. So it is me trying to have the best being I can be, best life in this world, get what I want. Possibilities is kind of random, and it's not tied to possibilities specifically of a person or a state. Potential comes from a unique being in a unique circumstances with its own essence, seeking to create a something world for all. And so and if you look at how you use the two words, you'll see that's what you do. Although people sometimes use them interchangeably, where potential really only comes from the essence of a being and its work and life, because otherwise potential is random. It's one of the ways I usually give a conscious shock, because people are in the world of good deeds. The idea of possibilities is very popular. It comes from the do-good world, right? Where there are more possibilities than there are poetry about it. So I think that may be true somewhere. But what I'm working on is getting people reconnected to specific concrete situations and people, so we learn to see things as whole. Because in order to go to potential, in essence, you have to start with them as a whole. If I look at Mira and I say, well, she has a few problems, I'll go read her work and I find this problem and that problem. We can do that to anybody. My God, I'm a mess. Anybody who wants to go look at me can see all sorts of problems. But if you work on the problems, you deny the whole. So a whole is it's the idea that you can only see a whole when you can see it at work, not any kind of work, but the work that's making a difference. So evaluating process in the education process, for example, when you're working on educating people, you're seeing them as a whole, I think, in their work or in their world, not as somebody who comes to you and says, I have a problem, Mira, please help me fix it. You're working on more manifesting the whole. And so, right?
Well, it's interesting because like I think about things sort of in this nestedness, right? And so people will say, I have a problem. And then we look at, well, that's a symptom. And what's actually the dynamic? And what I keep hearing as I'm listening to you is that you're talking about dynamics. So that there's a vitality, an action, a life force behind each of these different distinctions that you're making.
That's what my grandfather was trying to do when he talked to me through those 7 first principles. Number 1, start with seeing anything you're going to work with as a whole and help it see its value-adding process. My first book I wrote was The Responsible Business, and it was, your show's called Sustainability Now. And the question is, how do you get everyone to see that the way you work is creating a downstream effect? And if you can begin to see your essence, your wholeness, and what your role is in the whole, for it to have the value added that it needs, to add the value it needs, to add the value the next thing it needs, you're in a flow. And now you're actually thinking about wholes. And that whole has an essence, whoever, whatever it is in your world. And as a result of that essence, it has potential to do more for the world, for the value-adding process. So those first 3 are so foundational, and we don't educate people on them as children. Children are educated on how to be successful, get what they want, make a list for Christmas, all of which is about not adding value from yourself and your specific essence, but from some generic list. So the whole is a big deal.
So again, going back to this sense of dynamics, because you're talking about a relational connection between things as part of, as inextricable from the essence. Like the essence is yearning for expression, the expression of the essence is in a larger context, which is in a larger context, etc. Right. And there's a feed, a dynamism that goes both ways, it feels like, as I'm sensing it, because I can't think of it. I'm trying to grasp, and I've been working with trying to understand this stuff for a while, or trying to integrate it, to find a way to dance with it. And what I find is that that's the only way I know I can be with it, is actually to dance, that there's no static way to perceive it.
So we call that framework thinking, which means you look at something at work alive, and there has 3 characteristics that make it dance. One is dynamics, one is complexity, and one is essence. So all living things have dynamic, but they're different based on their essence. All complex living things have complexity, but it's based on what their essence is. So if you add to what you're subscribing, it would be, or I frame it in my language, it's learning a whole. And we have this from quantum physics, that anything alive is dynamic, complex, and unique, or essence-based. So I think you're adding words or drawing on words that I think fit with my description of how you think of a whole.
Thank you. I'm wondering if for me and for our audience, you would give us a little bit of a reference point or context for the word complexity.
Yeah. So we have Pythagoras started off, going back to ancient source. Pythagoras, and also Sri Aurobindo and several other people have said, you have to learn to see things at different levels of complexity. They're not just complex, they're can be seen at different levels. So the first level is a monad. You see it as one thing, and you get a complexity then that's related to everything it touches outside. It's one being next to other whole beings. You can look at the polarity, the two-term system, and some people make that diverting opposite. But when you're in a living system view, you look at them in complementarity, and or maybe building on one another, as I was doing with 7 first principles. And then you can look at them, if you're developed enough, to as a triad. And there are several different forms of triads: activating, restraining, and reconciling. If you look at that, you can see a different level of complexity. Or will, being, and function, which is a triad. Will, being, and function. Now you get the dimensions of it being, I have function, I also have a being, and state of being, and it wobbles around. Sometimes I'm upset, sometimes I'm steady. And will, which will be my level of personal agency compared to my passivity. Now, if you look at those as all at work together, and you've got another level of complexity. You can use a tetrad, which was Arthur Young, the founder or builder of the first helicopter. He was looking at all these things through Pythagorean building, and he said something about how you build a helicopter when he got to a 4-term system had to do with 4 dynamics. They had to go together. So the number of dynamics increases with the complexity. And then my first book was a 5-term system. And you can look, let's say, you could look at a forest, and one forest in one life shed has a monad, a dyad, a triad, and you can go up looking at the complexity if you're used to it. Now, anybody listening to me, this probably sounds terribly abstract, and it has a bit of math in it, but mostly it's a way I take anything. Somebody gives me a subject like racism, I take different levels of complexity and have people look at it and say, here's why you're making a mess. It's all polarized. It's all 2-term system. And the more a group present why and how we would stop racism, the more they tend to trigger the people who disagree with them, and it gets worse and worse and worse. Now, if you can go to a 3-term system or a 4-term system, you can see different dynamics. You're not polarized. You can see forces that are activating opposition and forces that are restraining us, really understanding what's going on. And you can find something bigger that takes both of those into account. And now you really understand at a deeper level. I do that with groups and slow them down, educate them on how to think at different levels of complexity. They innovate. They come up with solutions they've never had. And I did this. If you want to read the story, I worked in South Africa during the switch from apartheid, which we're still working on, hard business. And we got an award from Mandela for being able at Colgate Palmolive to make major switches in townships among 8 tribes. And there was racism and ethnic differences. And we worked in a way that we had no internal violence in Colgate because we went and worked on it a 6-term system, and people could see something they'd never seen before. And we designed work that had no competitive hierarchies, had only non-competitive contribution hierarchies. And as a result, we were able to meet the constitutional demand that the top of a company had to look ethnically like the top of the country. In other words, we had 95% white leading South Africa and Colgate, And we had to, within 5 years, create a 95% Black leadership at the top. And we did in 6 months.
Wow.
And Mandela gives an award, a constitutional award, because he knew it would take away the excuse that all the other companies had that you couldn't do this in an uneducated country, because Black Africans were not allowed to go to school. So great excuse, they're uneducated. Well, Sato said there are many ways to be educated. And one of them is having to build a hole if you're a Black township, when you're not given any resources, not allowed to go to school. What I know is all these people are have an amazing education, which we as whites did not have. We never had to figure that out. We followed somebody's pattern. So we were in 6 months using this idea of different levels of complexity and different frameworks, how to lead together. So the complexity question you had is really the source of thinking innovatively. You learn to move up paradigms, up levels of complexity in an orderly way, in a way everyone can see what's going on. There are no behind the scenes, no power structures. Everybody's working with being able to build an understanding of complexity, and every individual can initiate a change. So we, my book, my 7th book, which will be out hopefully in 2023, and maybe we'll get lucky and before I die, I get it finished, is all about what we did in South Africa and how we did it using complexity, dynamics, essence, and essence thinking.
You know, you spoke to so many things just now, and I don't want to skirt over any of it, and we have such a limited period of time and so much else to discuss. However, you started giving us an example about how to address racism, and then you started talking about South Africa. In the process, you talked about the tetrad, or one of the, I'm sorry, the law of 3, which is the activating force, the restraining force, and the reconciling force.
Right.
And I don't want to skirt by that because it's so powerful, and it just gives such a powerful example of these different orders of magnitude in terms of complexity, but also you used it to start talking about racism.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you could bring us to the reconciling force from the polarization that we see happening in this country, not just over racism, but politics, whatever. But if you could take it to the next level for us, that would be amazing.
I will do that. I'm going to use racism go up, but just because we need something concrete. All right. In South Africa, we started with premises, and I have a recording I did, or 6-hour, of what I'm going to talk about. Anyone who's listening to your show and would like to watch that can send me an email at carol@sanford.com, and I will give them the key, what you call the password. All right, so now I'm going to tell you. We were working mostly Black and white, but because we had the Afrikaners and the English who were there also, but they were seen as opposites. And the why? Because we believe race is real. We make up the idea of race. It doesn't exist. You can't really do blood tests for it. Although my father, who was the head of a Ku Klux Klan group, Regenerated in Texas, believe you could. I know. So we brought in a bunch of geneticists and I've forgotten who else. This was quite a while ago now, who over and over again to all the whites, the 8 tribes, the Afrikaners and English, showed them there was no real thing. It was a color of skin based on the climate you were in. It was where it originated and evolutionary. And so once we got rid of the ideal that there was races, it was races. We said, well, what is there? And we said there's essence of each individual. That's all there is, period. And so we're going to design work systems which have to do with the development of each individual's potential based on their motivation and the motivation of the company to create a viable product company. And so the reconciler, so you had your activating and restraining, that was mostly Black or my ideas and your ideas. And we were trying to, people before us were trying to do anti-racism campaign and educate people on how not to be racist. Well, it's better if you educate them on there's no such thing. And what you want to do is learn to see each individual. That's a reconciling force. And when you build a work system where there's no way to bias where people who can get promoted, who can be paid more, we built a system where every individual did that for themselves, which is hard for people to imagine. But I am talking in the 7th book and some in the video we did, showing how we removed any chance for anyone to discriminate by redesigning the work system. That was a reconciler based on an idea which we were all depending on, that is, there are different races and we're treating them differently. If there are no different races and you design a non-competitive contributing hierarchy of work, you have created a reconciler and taken away the polarization. That's a big thing. So am I making enough sense for you?
You are, and the very notion that there's no race is hugely disruptive, and it brings up for me the question about, well, what about culture? Because if we're talking about nestedness, people are nested in their neighborhoods, in their cultures, in their traditions, and I'm wondering how that plays a role in looking at the individual and not looking at race.
Well, cultures are created by beliefs and by rituals. And so if you have beliefs and you need to create rituals to hold the culture together, you have to unwind the rituals and unwind the beliefs, but you don't do it based on false premises. So if you want to change a culture, you have to question all the rituals, everything you do that's sacred, and then ask what belief that's based on. Write the premise. What is it like? What we did said it's based on the idea that there's such a thing as race and that there's no such thing as individuality or essence. And so if you change the belief, you say, how do we redesign rituals that no longer reinforce that culture? The big thing I'm doing here is saying you make it obvious to everyone you talk about it fairly regularly, the premises you were using are false. And you reflect on those and keep saying, how we design work that are based on that false premise? How do we design rituals that are based on that false premise? How do you define status? All this takes a while, but the minute you unravel the core false premise, like there's no such thing as race. I wrote an article also, I forgot where it was in American Management Association, that said the essence of diversity, or the core to diversity is essence, and the core to inclusion is individual initiative. So if you have everyone, and in Colgate and South Africa version, we built something called Promises Beyond Ableness. And that's a big concept. It's in many of my books, but it means you promise a customer or earth or some a meaningful entity to do something for them that they really need that will add value and change their life. And then you go get support of the company, education, resources, and you set out with a team you pull together, you make that happen. And now you get a pay increment and a promotion increment based on your initiation. But there's no top, there's no limited number. Everyone can do that. Everyone. And everyone did. We had 6,000 people in South Africa. Everyone had a promise beyond ableness, and they had to get the resources from our equivalent of a venture capital committee. But no one could say you can't do that except the committee. But everyone built a plan, built a team, and everyone went after that, including making product every day. And so we disrupted the way people buy us by saying, and ultimate inclusion is every individual.
So
Right?
I have to ask you, and I'm noticing our time, and I'm
Oh.
so greedy for more time with you. We didn't get to discuss most of what I wanted to even ask, but you said that one of the mandates or one of the objectives was within 5 years to change the management of Colgate from 90% white to 90% black, or whatever the
No,
percentage was.
yeah, it's not by number. It has to match the population. This is in the
Right,
Constitution.
right. To match the.
So we didn't say that. The government said that.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say, how do you square that with there's no race?
The government said the population must match the current figures, and that was set up by the government. That had nothing to do with us, but we used it as a way to show you can do anything. We used it as a contra shock. And then the pay and promotion, which came from the Promise Beyond Ableness, was what really changed everything. We did the first 6 months in order to show people, as Sadeo said, we want to show everyone in Africa that we believe everyone, no matter what their method of education is, have what it takes to be the top. And so all that was a disruptor. And then after that, we introduced the idea of no race, but we didn't start that. We used it later.
That's awesome. So wow. I do want to ask you if I can have a few more minutes about the ALS. And you said earlier in our conversation, the purpose of death.
Yeah.
And this is something that you're facing squarely
Yeah.
with such grace and courage. And you might rebel against my characterization of that, but that's my impression.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could speak about that a little bit.
Well, everyone's going to die. They don't want to, but if you learn early in life, and I did a lot of work in hospice and I was with people dying, including eventually my mother and my life partner and my sister-in-law, a bunch of people. And I noticed a couple of things. It's the more you were thinking about death of others, it kept you thinking about your own death, and it became more real. And so I learned a long time ago, and I said, my daughter will say to you, since she was born, she remembers to say, well, when I die, and I was saying it all the time. And part of that was to keep desensitizing me and reminding myself, I'm going to die. And who knew I would die of ALS, which is the most feared, except war, way of dying, or because you suffocate is how it happens. Now I have another plan, but We may not get to that, but they have come to believe that the purpose of death is to open portals into our aliveness and what's expected of us when we're alive. But we don't, in the Western world, talk enough about death, do rituals of practicing dying, experiencing not literal dying, but ego dying. And my son had a hard time when we started because it's very hard and he hadn't lived as close to me. But while he was here for Christmas, we talked about it every day. And eventually he was able to talk about it and to say, you know, and notice it makes him very sad. He doesn't want me to die. And I said, but I'm not afraid of dying. And if you're not afraid of dying, you're working on the purpose of dying, which is being able to see, for me, what time I had left. I'd said I wanted to write one more book. I'd probably lived that long because I felt like I finally understood one last thing that you can only understand when you're up against about to leave a body. And I decided I wanted all the members of my community, of the change agent community, the business community, to be able to be step by step with me if they wanted. And if a lot wanted to, they wanted to know what I'm going through. And so at the end of all of our online meetings we have about 20 times a year, I tell them, here's what's happening. I now have trouble talking. See, but you can still understand me. So as long as you can, I'll keep talking. I can't write anymore, but I can still type. Here's my mind, what goes on. I go through thinking, I suddenly don't care about stuff at all anymore. I can't even make myself go shopping for anything I would use in the future. The future became kind of unimportant. But all of you, and I've got plans for being able to have people with me when I'm in active dying if they want, so they can experience not me, but when you get to stand in the portal with someone who's dying, there's a kind of field that's created that has you, this is what I found. Maybe I make this stuff up, right? But I found that when my husband was dying, I felt almost like another world of view open to me. And I could see what my work was. And I've lived 20 years since he died. And it changed my work. It changed the way I saw the world. But people don't walk into that process. And there it is. The Tibetan Buddhists believe you're in a 4 Bardo cycle. You have a birth, which you chose who you were going to be, who your parents would be, how many troubles you'd have, how hard your life would. And again, who knows whether we do that. But then you live a life and then you exit into the 3rd portal where you get to make some choices. If karma exists, I choose to believe karma exists because it makes me a better person. And then you're back in some universal process. You have to have a cosmology, not that one, if it didn't resonate with you, but death itself in every culture and everywhere opens this kind of field that we can enter, while those of us who are alive, we can enter this field with temporarily the edge of the passing person, and it can restore, renew, reopen us. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't awaken ourselves maybe a few years before death and make use of it. So, and if karma is right, I get to start over and clean up some of the mess I made. So that's my cosmology, which you don't have to accept.
Well, I so appreciate you sharing it with us. And it makes sense to me. Years ago, I read the Carlos Castaneda books. And
Yeah,
one of the things that stood out vividly for me was holding death on your left shoulder as an advisor.
yeah.
And our lives would be so much richer if we were to allow ourselves to know that it's a passing moment and to utilize it well. Yeah.
and not be afraid of it. I have not, from the moment I was diagnosed with ALS, been afraid. I have been mindful of things I had never thought I would think, but I also noticed I had work still to do. And so that's what I'm doing, writing. I'm putting together a Substack to take a lot of ideas like potential and possibilities and write those polarities we've made and create a whole set of short articles. I've got about 30 written.
And so what's the best way for people to be able to access your work, Carol?
My website is carolsanford.com.
And that's CAROL, no E.
Right.
Mhm.
And then SAN, no D, FORD, no D in the middle, or no Stanford like ST, carolsanford.com. And it has most of the story and what's in my book. It has several different podcasts. I ran something called Business Second Opinion, where I critiqued Harvard Business Review, one article at a time, and gave an alternative. Those are all there, 150 of those or so. I've got Carol Sanford Institute, which is for businesses, where there's another couple of podcasts I ran for years, and videos and stories, and I'm not opening any new ventures for people to join now. But if you know someone who's in one of my communities, you're welcome to ask them. And sometimes they will invite you and sometimes they won't. I'm not charged. So that would be probably how best to find me.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm very, very deeply, deeply grateful to you for your time and for the work that you've done in the world and the impact that you have and continue to have rippling out beyond you. And thank you to all of you who carry the torch, who engage in these interesting and challenging conversations, who take action in the world. I want to give you our heartfelt thanks. And thanks also to my partner in crime here at Sustainability Now, Scott Billy, who's also our producer. And that's it for today. So live your best life, love the world around you, and together we can save the world.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.